I'm Bob at ILikeToMakeStuff. Today we're going to make a crosscut sled that you can store away and an extension wing. This is a crosscut sled, which is a simple but extremely valuable tool if you have a table saw. A lot of people ask me about this. I never made a video on it, so we're going to do that. And since we're making a video on this, we're going to make a place to store it. We're going to put it down here underneath the table saw, and while we're down here, we're going to make some storage for all the other stuff that goes with a table saw, blades and guards and jigs and all that. And since we're going to store all that, we're going to turn it into a box that acts as an extension table for the saw itself. Since we've got that extension, we may as well go ahead and make a flip-up extension so we have a huge surface to be able to push through a full sheet of plywood. Let's do it. For making the sled, the first thing you have to do is make the front and the back rails, and those pieces shouldn't have any bow or curve in them at all. So to do that, we're going to take some pieces of 3/4 inch plywood, which is already pretty straight, and laminate them together into a block, and that should hold it in shape so it doesn't bow or curve over time. So let's cut these down and glue them up. Most of these pieces are pretty flat, but actually one of them has kind of a bow in it. You can even see it by looking at the piece. Luckily, by gluing these pieces up with lots and lots of glue and then clamping them together, it's going to draw those two pieces into line, and the glue should hold them together. And then the structural integrity of the two pieces of plywood all the way across is going to stop them from warping too much over time. One of the problems when using this much glue is that the two pieces slide around a lot. So instead of having to worry about the two pieces sliding like this while you're clamping them up, you can use some salt and sprinkle it inside on top of the glue surface. You don't need a whole lot, but it adds a little bit of friction along the surfaces to keep the pieces from sliding around as much. So while we're waiting on those to dry, I'm going to go ahead and cut down the plate for the bottom of the sled. Now this is just a piece of plywood or MDF or whatever you want to use. I'm going to use 1/2 inch plywood to keep the weight down. Got all the pieces cut down, and so now we're going to put these together to make the most simple box that you can possibly think of. 4 sides connected with pocket holes. And I always mention pocket holes are not for every situation, but they certainly work perfectly fine in a lot of situations. Now before I screw this box together, I need to put some stuff on the inside of one of the faces. I'm going to put on some drawer slides so that we can have a vertical panel that can slide out of the box. So I'm going to put those drawer slides in here while I can still get to the inside of this panel. I'm using a drywall square so that I can have a square edge, or a perpendicular edge, to the outside front, so I can get these in place and screw them down. I goofed up a little bit. On these pocket hole jigs, you need to set where the top collar piece goes based on the thickness of the material. I had this set incorrectly and I drilled all the holes, so the holes actually go too far into the material. So it's going to be kind of ugly, but I am going to put new holes next to these old holes. Luckily, it will be on the inside, so you'll never see it. So basically we just made a box, but you'll notice here that the bottom face actually extends past the outside edge. And that's because we're going to put some leveling feet underneath this so that we can adjust the top of it to perfectly match up with the table saw. So to put the leveling feet on this thing, we're going to use some threaded inserts. You got this small piece that gets inserted into the wood, and then that will accept a bolt that then you can screw in and out to change the height of that particular corner. Now, I'm going to have a link to all the hardware as well as the digital plans for this whole project down in the description. We had a little bit of blowout on that because of that big drill bit coming through this side. So for the second one, we're actually going to use a piece as a backer board, clamp it in place, and then drill into that one. That should help preserve some of the face that we actually want to keep on this bottom piece. So with using this type of bolt, there's not going to be a great way to screw and unscrew them to change the height. If you used a hex bolt here, you could use a wrench from the side to adjust the position. You also may want to use some Loctite within this once you get it into the right position so that it doesn't unscrew itself over time. Now also, this whole box will be connected to the side of the saw. So once you get this set, it should kind of stay where you put it, theoretically. All right, let's put this thing in place and try to figure out exactly where it needs to be vertically. So the point here is that it's going to sit right next to the saw and be attached to the side of the saw through these holes. So we're going to be putting some more threaded inserts in the face here so that we can drive a bolt through the table saw into the side of this to lock them together. But before we can do that, we got to get this vertically spaced correctly, which means we have to adjust those bolts that we put in the bottom. Now we're going to move on to the crosscut sled, and just so you know, this is the simplest possible crosscut sled that I could come up with. There's tons of variations of this with all sorts of attachments for tracks and guides and all sorts of stuff, but this is bare bones, will serve the purpose, and honestly, I've never used any of that other stuff effectively. I always use the basics of a crosscut sled. And if you're not familiar with what a crosscut sled is used for, let's talk about that really quickly. Basically, it's a big flat area that you can lay a board on to run through the saw, but the big advantage is having a perpendicular fence back here that your piece goes against, so you're always going to get perfectly 90-degree cuts relative to the blade. So when you're putting a sled like this together, one of the big keys is getting this back fence perpendicular to the blade, and to do that, you have to kind of adjust it. You have to make a cut, then square it up, and then be able to adjust this fence, and that's part of the process of putting this whole thing together. The front edge doesn't matter so much. It's really just there for stability and to hold the boards together. When I laminated these pieces together, there's some glue squeeze out down here, which I don't want because I want this piece to sit perfectly flat against my plywood. So I'm going to run these through the table saw just to get rid of that. You could also just sand it off or plane it off. So the first step is going to be to put on the front fence, and this just needs to be glued in place, and then I'm going to drive some screws up through the bottom just to attach it and make sure it's really good and solid, because like I said before, this is going to be holding all of these pieces together. Making sure to countersink these so that the screw heads don't scrape on the table. This is the bottom side of this whole sled. That's the front fence. We've got that one in place. Now we're going to temporarily put the back fence in, and this is really just to hold the whole thing together for the next step. I'm going to drive in 2 screws on the end. These are temporary. They're going to come out, so I'm not adding any glue. The way that the sled works is it sits down in the guides that are in a table saw. So we have to make some runners that fit in those guides to go on the bottom of the sled to keep it on track. And to do that, I've started with a piece of 1x that I trimmed down. So this is the same thickness as a 1x that you would get at the store, 1x4, 1x6, whatever. And this is just a strip off the end. And it fits almost perfectly. It's a little bit tight, which is actually kind of good, but it fits perfectly down in there. So I'm going to cut 2 pieces of this to length, and we'll start working with that. I'm going to leave these pieces a little bit tight for now because we can always plane them down on the edge later to make a really smooth fit. But actually you would probably want it a little bit tighter rather than a little bit looser. These runners are not as deep as these slots are because you don't actually want them to touch the bottom. You want them to be attached to the bottom of the sled when it is laying on this surface. So to make sure that these are in the right place and not all the way bottomed out, I'm going to put some washers down and set the runners on top of the washers. You can do the same thing with pennies or dimes or anything like this. Just stack them up to get the desired height. In this case, you just want it to be a little bit proud of the surface. Next up, I'm going to add some wood glue to these, just a little bit, all the way across them, and then set the sled on top of it and weight it down so that it gets glued to these runners. Then we'll come back and add some screws later to keep them in place. Big thing here is you want to be careful not to put so much glue that it squeezes out and gets on your table. So I've marked the center point on this, and I just have to set it on the runners, roughly centered on the saw. I want the center point of this sled to be right over the blade. I've got some weight here on top of those right above the runners to make sure that the plywood is in full contact with the pieces for the runners, and then after that dries, we can take it off and they'll stay where we put them. It's been a little bit, so now the glue has dried on these runners, so they are held against the bottom piece. So now if I take all these washers out of the space, we can make sure that this slides easily before doing anything else. These are completely attached now. We're going to reinforce that with some screws. So I want to make sure to countersink some holes so that the screw heads will be flush or below the surface of this piece. I've got these screwed down. I'm going to take a sanding block and just lightly sand over one side, the same side of each one of the runners, and then place it back in there and make sure it moves smoothly. If you do too much, then there's going to be some horizontal slop. You don't want that. You want to make sure that it fits really tightly, but is also pretty easy to move forward and backward. Now if you did have quite a bit that you needed to take off, you could always use a hand plane on these, and if I have to, I'll end up using that, but I don't really have that much to remove. That sounds pretty rough, but it is actually moving smoothly, and the way it's going to sound even better is to put a little bit of paste wax on the bottom of those runners and maybe even on the bottom of this piece of plywood. We'll get to that later on. So next up, I'm going to raise the blade pretty high, not all the way up, but pretty high on the table saw and run the sled through it, but not cut through the back fence. We want to get right up to the back fence, but not cut through it yet. Now that we've got that slot cut, we've got to do a couple of things, one of which is to move this up, and then we want to add some safety blocks here to catch that blade so you don't actually lean into it or accidentally put your hands into it. But even more importantly than that is getting this perpendicular to this cut line. So first we're going to put in these blocks and maybe some pieces on the ends, then we will square this piece up. So we're going to take a couple of these blocks and sandwich them right here just to stop the blade. That way you shouldn't ever have to push the blade through all 3 of these pieces together, just for safety. And then also I've got a couple of small blocks to put on the ends, or you could put them in here, just to reinforce the ends of this to give the whole thing a little bit more structure. I'm going to take those 2 center pieces, line them up with this back corner, and then move the fence up to it, line it up with the outside. And that's going to give us where this point needs to be, and then we can flex that other end. So once I've got this in place where I want it, we're going to countersink a hole from below and drive a screw up through it. Now we've got a pivot point on this side, so we can bend the whole thing or move the whole thing off that pivot point. So we want to use a square along this cut edge and along the back side of the fence, and we're going to use that to make sure that it is a perpendicular fence from the cut line. And the good thing about not gluing this fence down but just screwing through it is if you ever need to adjust it for any reason, you can just remove a screw underneath it, get it square again, and put a screw back in. And now that I've got it square, I want to make sure to clamp it in place and make sure it stays where I put it while I'm adding the clamp. And once I get it perfectly square and I've got it held into place, then I'm going to go back and put several screws across the entire thing to stop it from moving. Now these pieces on the back are going to do a couple things. One, it's going to stop the blade like I mentioned, but also you're going to be pulling and pushing on this fence, and that's going to put a lot of force down on the connection. Since there's no glue, you want to try to maintain that. So these blocks being screwed in from below and from the front will help give it some strength. Also, it's just a block. It doesn't really need to be any particular shape, so I'm going to cut down the corner just to knock it off so it doesn't look so square. You could do any shape you want, or you just leave it as it is.
I used a roundover bit on both sides of the back fence because it also acts as a handle, so it needs to be nice and smooth.
So this thing is pretty much done. The only thing is I'm going to go on these rails with some paste wax, and that should just help it move a little bit more smoothly on the cast iron top. This surface doesn't touch anything, so really we're adding the wax to this outside surface. Pretty good. The crosscut sled is now finished, and there's 2 really important things when you're making a crosscut sled. You want to make sure that your back fence is perfectly flat, and to check that, I'm using this straight edge. It's looking pretty good. Now the other thing is to make sure that this fence is perpendicular to the blade, and to check that, we're going to use something called the 5-cut method. You can look up the specifics for this online, but basically, you put this piece against the fence, you make a cut, and then you turn it 90 degrees. You do that 5 times, so you end up back to the place that you started. In that remaining piece on that last cut, you measure and make sure that both ends of that piece are the same thickness. If they're not the same thickness, then that means your piece is not square. This is the final cut, and I'm going to measure it down here on this end, and it is 2 1/16. Then I'm going to measure down on this end, and it is almost 2 1/16. So not absolutely perfect, but within probably a 64th. Something like that, and for me, for this particular sled, is good enough. Now we're ready to level this box against the side of the saw. I went ahead and swapped out these bolts for some hex bolts that we can easily adjust with a wrench. I've got the box now level with the tabletop, which is really, really nice. Now you could leave it totally separate, but I want to lock it to the table because I'm going to put an extension wing, and so I need it to be nice and sturdy. And to do that, I'm going to put some more threaded inserts in this outside edge and then drive in some bolts through the holes in the side of the table. So I got to mark these before I take it off. I'm going to drill the holes to put in these threaded inserts, but in this case, this is an uneven surface, and the center of that hole is in kind of a weird spot. So I'm going to use a brad point bit, and it has a little tip, a little brad on the end of it, to keep the bit where I want it to start, and it's not going to wander as easily. The box is firmly attached to the table, it's good to go. Now we got to put on the wing on the outside face here, and to do that we're going to use another piece of plywood and these brackets. These are made for a table leaf, and so this goes against one surface and then comes up like that to lift out the wing. It's also got a quick release here, so you just squeeze that and the whole thing comes down. I'm going to use 2 of these, and each one holds about 300 pounds. I ran into a little bit of a problem. I put these brackets on and then they didn't quite sit correctly on the box that I had made, and I went to look at it and realized that they're actually not 90 degrees. When you put the speed square next to it, you can see that the bracket sticks past this edge, which means they're more than 90 degrees. That's not really going to work for this case. So we're going to use some tongue depressors to actually shim the bracket to get it closer to 90. You can see that if I put this underneath the speed square, it will change the angle. And so I can also put it underneath the bracket to change this back angle as well. We're going to try that out and see if it works. We've got the wing on, that's good to go. Now we're going to make a slot for this sled to fit into. I've cut a couple of spacers that are 5 inches, the same depth as that. I'm going to set these in place and then nail in just some slides to kind of guide it into where I want it to be. And the last piece is to put on the sliding storage wall and just connect it to the drawer slides. The last thing I'm going to do here is put on a little handle piece so I can pull this in and out easily. But this is actually just one of the many different ways that you could customize this particular wall to meet your needs. It's a flat panel, so you can hang anything you want on it. You can hang guards like this, you can hang individual blades, a dado stack, there's all sorts of things. And if you decide to make this entire box a little bit deeper, you can hang even bigger things on here without them running into the sled. I quickly put some stuff on this wall, and it'll probably change over time. Yours will be entirely different. But it is a limited amount of space, and with every table saw, there's a bunch of stuff that wouldn't fit in there. For instance, the miter gauge on this won't fit in there, but luckily, you've got this entire inside face that you can hang this and other things like it right in here. All right, let's look at this entire thing. And here it is. It's actually a combination of projects if you think about it. The crosscut sled by itself is a huge help to anybody with a table saw. Plus, everybody can use more storage and a bigger table to cut on. We're going to have some plans available for this thing in case you want to make it for yourself, and you can easily adjust the height to match your particular saw. Something like this will totally work whether you have a cabinet saw or a contractor saw. If you learned some new things from this video, please let us know down in the comments because that will help us make better videos for you guys. We've also got a whole bunch of other types of videos that you may want to check out over there, and if you're not subscribed, go ahead and do that as well. That's it for this one, guys. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Perfectly flat. They don't have it. Yeah. Sled. That's the word. Jeebas.